Chapter 3 The Second of the Three Spirits. Awaking, Scrooge found himself in his bedroom. There was no doubt about that. But it and his own adjoining sitting room, into which he shuffled in his slippers, attracted by a great light there, had undergone a surprising transformation. The walls and ceiling were so hung with living green that it looked a perfect grove. The leaves of holly, mistletoe, and ivy reflected back the light, as if many little mirrors had been scattered there. And such a mighty blaze went roaring up the chimney as that petrifaction of a hearth had never known in Scrooge's time, or Marley's, or for many and many a winter season gone. Heaped upon the floor, to form a kind of throne, were turkeys, geese, game, brawn, great joints of meat, pigs, long wreaths of sausages, mince pies, plum pudding, barrels of oysters, red-hot chestnuts, cherry-cheeked apples, juicy oranges, luscious pears, immense twelfth cakes, and great bowls of punch. In easy state upon the couch there sat a giant, glorious to see, who bore a glowing torch in shape not unlike Plenty's horn, and who raised it high to shed its light on Scrooge, as he came peeping round the door.
Come in, and know me better, man. I am the ghost of Christmas present. Look upon me. You have never seen the like of me before.
Never.
Have never walked forth with the younger members of my family? Meaning, for I am very young, my elder brothers born in these late years?
Pursued the phantom. I don't think I have. I'm afraid I have not. Have you had many brothers, Spirit? More than 1,800! A tremendous family to provide for. Spirit, conduct me where you will. I went forth last night on compulsion, and I learnt a lesson which is working now. Tonight, if you have aught to teach me, let me profit by it.
Touch my robe. Come in and know me better, man. I am the ghost of Christmas present.
Scrooge did as he was told, and held fast. Spirit, take me where you will. So far I have learned a great lesson. I want to learn more from you.
Then touch my robe, Ebenezer Scrooge.
The room and its contents all vanished instantly, and they stood in the city streets upon a snowy Christmas morning. Scrooge and the ghost passed on, invisible, straight to Scrooge's clerk's, and on the threshold of the door the spirit smiled, and stopped to bless Bob Cratchit's dwelling with the sprinklings of his torch. Think of that! Bob had but 15 bob a week himself. He pocketed on Saturdays but 15 copies of his Christian name. And yet the ghost of Christmas present blessed his 4-roomed house. Then up rose Mrs. Cratchit, Cratchit's wife, dressed out but poorly in a twice-turned gown, brave in ribbons, which are cheap and make a goodly show for 6pence, and she laid the cloth, assisted by Belinda Cratchit, second of her daughters, also brave in ribbons, while Master Peter Cratchit plunged a fork into the saucepan of potatoes, and, getting the corners of his monstrous shirt-collar, Bob's private property conferred upon his son and heir in honor of the day, into his mouth, rejoiced to find himself so gallantly attired, and yearned to show his linen in a fashionable park. And now 2 smaller Cratchits, boy and girl, came tearing in, screaming that outside the baker's they had smelt the goose, and known it for their own, and basking in luxurious thoughts of sage and onion, these young Cratchits danced about the table, and exalted Master Peter Cratchit to the skies, where he, not proud, although his collars nearly choked him, blew the fire until the slow potatoes, bubbling up, knocked loudly at the saucepan lid to be let out and peeled. "Whatever got your precious father, then?" said Mrs. Cratchit, "and your brother, Tiny Tim? And Martha weren't as late as last Christmas Day by half an hour." Mrs. Cratchit and the children were hard at work making their humble Christmas dinner. "Wherever are your father and Tiny Tim?" "Here he comes!" Mr. Cratchit put Tiny Tim down. The sound of his crutch clacked upon the floor. "And how did Tiny Tim behave?" "As good as gold." "There's father coming!" cried the two young Cratchits, who were everywhere at once. In came little Bob, the father, with at least 3 feet of comforter, exclusive of the fringe, hanging down before him, and his threadbare clothes darned up and brushed to look seasonable, and Tiny Tim upon his shoulder. Alas, for Tiny Tim, he bore a little crutch, and had his limbs supported by an iron frame. The two young Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim, and bore him off to the wash-house that he might hear the pudding singing in the copper. "And how did little Tim behave?" asked Mrs. Cratchit. "As good as gold," said Bob, "and better. Somehow he gets thoughtful sitting by himself so much, and thinks the strangest things you've ever heard. He told me, coming home, that he hoped that people saw him in the church, because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant to them to remember upon Christmas Day who made lame beggars walk and blind men see." Bob's voice was tremulous when he told them this, and trembled more when he said that Tiny Tim was growing strong and hearty. His active little crutch was heard upon the floor, and back came Tiny Tim before another word was spoken, escorted by his brother and sister to his stool beside the fire, and while Bob, turning up his cuffs, as if, poor fellow, they were capable of being made more shabby, compounded some hot mixture in a jug with gin and lemons, and stirred it round and round, and put it on the hob to simmer, Master Peter and the two ubiquitous young Cratchits went to fetch the goose, with which they soon returned in high procession. There never was such a goose. Bob said he didn't believe there ever was such a goose cooked. Its tenderness and flavor, size and cheapness, were the themes of universal admiration. Eked out by the applesauce and mashed potatoes, it was a sufficient dinner for the whole family. Indeed, as Mrs. Cratchit said with great delight, surveying one small atom of a bone upon the dish, they hadn't ate it all at last. Yet every one had enough, and the youngest Cratchits in particular were steeped in sage and onion to the eyebrows. At last the dinner was all done, the cloth was cleared, the hearth swept, and the fire made up. The compound in the jug being tasted and considered perfect, apples and oranges were put upon the table, and a shovelful of chestnuts on the fire. Then all the Cratchit family drew around the hearth in what Bob Cratchit called a circle, and at Bob Cratchit's elbow stood a family display of glass, 2 tumblers and a custard top without a handle. These held the hot stuff from the jug, however, as well as golden goblets would have done, and Bob served it out with beaming looks, while the chestnuts on the fire sputtered and crackled noisily. Then Bob proposed, "A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears! God bless us!" which all the family re-echoed. "God bless us, every one!" said Tiny Tim, the last of all. He sat very close at his father's side upon his little stool. Bob held his withered little hand in his, as if he loved the child and wished to keep him by his side, and dreaded that he might be taken from him. The Cratchit family sat down to their simple dinner. "Merry Christmas, my dears! God bless us! God bless us, every one!" Scrooge raised his head speedily on hearing his own name. "Mr. Scrooge," said Bob, "I'll give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast." "The founder of the feast, indeed!" cried Mrs. Cratchit, reddening. "I wish I had him here. I'd give him a piece of my mind to feast upon, and I hope he'd have a good appetite for it." "My dear," said Bob, "the children! Christmas Day!" It should be a Christmas day, I'm sure, said she, on which one drinks the health of such an odious, stingy, hard, unfeeling man as Mr. Scrooge. You know he is, Robert. Nobody knows it better than you do, poor fellow. My dear, was Bob's mild answer, Christmas Day. I'll drink his health for your sake and the day's, said Mrs. Cratchit. Not for his. Long life to him! A Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. He'll be very merry and very happy, I have no doubt. The children drank the toast after her. It was the first of their proceedings which had no heartiness in it. Tiny Tim drank it last of all, but he didn't care twopence for it. Scrooge was the ogre of the family. The mention of his name cast a dark shadow on the party, which was not dispelled for a full 5 minutes. After it had passed away, they were 10 times merrier than before, from the mere relief of Scrooge the Baleful being done with. They were not a handsome family. They were not well dressed. Their shoes were far from being waterproof. Their clothes were scanty, and Peter might have known, and very likely did, the inside of a pawnbroker's. But they were happy, grateful, pleased to be with one another, and contented with the time. And when they faded, and looked happier yet in the bright sprinklings of the spirit's torch at parting, Scrooge had his eye upon them, and especially on Tiny Tim, until the last. The Cratchits were poor, but they were having a wonderful time celebrating with each other.
Come.
Tell me, Spirit, will Tiny Tim live?
I see a vacant seat in the corner and a crutch without an owner. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die.
No, Spirit! Say he will be spared!
One of your own words just the other day.
If they would rather die, then they had better do it, and decrease the surplus population. Scrooge was horrified to hear his words repeated. The ghost took old Scrooge to many places. They witnessed miners celebrating. Next, they visited a remote lighthouse. Even there, the workers were celebrating Christmas. And then upon a ship, Scrooge witnessed sailors enjoying Christmas carols and telling tales of Christmas past. Quick as a flash, the two were back in the city. Scrooge recognized the laugh of his own nephew. It was a great surprise to Scrooge, as this scene vanished, to hear a hearty laugh. It was a much greater surprise to Scrooge to recognize it as his own nephew's, and to find himself in a bright, dry, gleaming room, with the Spirit standing smiling by his side, and looking at that same nephew. Ha ha ha! He said that Christmas was a humbug? He believed it too? More's the shame for him. He said that Christmas was a humbug, as I live, cried Scrooge's nephew. He believed it too. More the shame for him, Fred, said Scrooge's niece indignantly. He's a comical old fellow, said Scrooge's nephew. That's the truth, and not so pleasant as he might be. However, his offences carry their own punishment, and I have nothing to say against him. Who suffers by his ill whims? Himself, always. Here he takes it into his head to dislike us, and he won't come to dine with us. What's the consequence? Indeed, I think he loses a very good dinner, interrupted Scrooge's niece. Everyone else said the same, and they must be allowed to have been competent judges, because they had just had dinner, and, with the dessert upon the table, were clustered around by the fire by lamplight. He may hate Christmas till he dies, but I will stop in to wish him a merry one every year. It might make him more generous. Scrooge's niece sat at the harp. Everyone had a merry time. Even Scrooge himself ended up enjoying the music. After tea, they had some music, for they were a musical family and knew what they were about. But they didn't devote the whole evening to music. "Here's a new game," said Scrooge. "1 half-hour, Spirit, only one." It was a game called Yes and No, where Scrooge's nephew had to think of something, and the rest must find out what. He only answering their questions with yes or no, as the case was. The fire of questioning to which he was exposed elicited from him that he was thinking of an animal, a live animal, rather a disagreeable animal, a savage animal, an animal that growled and grunted sometimes, and talked sometimes, and lived in London, and walked about the streets, and wasn't made a show of, and wasn't led by anybody, and didn't live in a menagerie, and was never killed in a market, and was not a horse or a donkey or a cow or a bull or a tiger or a dog or a pig or a cat or a bear. At every new question put to him, his nephew burst into a fresh roar of laughter, and was so inexpressibly tickled that he was obliged to get up off the sofa and stamp. At last the plump sister cried out, "I've found it! I've found it out! I know what it is, Fred! I know what it is!" "What is it?" cried Fred. "It's your uncle, Scrooge!" Which it certainly was. Admiration was the sentiment, though some objected that the reply to "Is it a bear?" ought to have been yes. Guests took turns guessing what Scrooge's nephew was acting out. "I've got it! You're Uncle Scrooge! You're correct! Ah ha 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 ha!" Scrooge was hurt, but still he wanted to stay. The spirit had other ideas. They visited sick beds where families visited their ill relatives. Much they saw, and far they went, and many homes they visited, but always with a happy end. The spirit stood beside sick beds, and they were cheerful. On foreign lands they were close at home. By struggling men, and they were patient in their greater hope. By poverty, and it was rich. In almshouse, hospital, and jail, in misery's every refuge, where vain man in his little brief authority had not made fast the door, and barred the spirit out, he left his blessing, and taught Scrooge his precepts. They visited poorhouses. Then they visited jails. Everywhere they went, people were celebrating despite their poor circumstances. And then he noticed the ghost's appearance had changed.
My time on earth is very short. It ends tonight, at midnight.
Tonight? The clock struck 12. The ghost of Christmas present vanished. The bell struck 12 and the spirit disappeared. Scrooge looked about him for the ghost and saw it no more. As the last stroke ceased to vibrate, he remembered the prediction of old Jacob Marley, and lifting up his eyes, beheld a solemn phantom, draped and hooded, coming like a mist along the ground toward him.